Okay, let's dive in. Every animal out there shares this one really basic need, right? Breathing,
Hmm.
getting oxygen in, CO2 out. Seems simple,
Hmm. Universal.
but the ways they do it, I mean, it gets incredibly varied, sometimes just, well, surprising.
It really does. And what's so fascinating is how evolution has shaped these systems, not just to work, but to work perfectly for specific lifestyles, specific
That is
challenges.
exactly what we're getting into today.
Hmm.
We're doing a deep dive into gas exchange systems. Specifically, we're looking at amphibians versus birds, two very different approaches.
Right. We got some good sources, biology texts, comparative stuff, even some newer research.
Yeah, and the plan is to unpack the anatomy, the mechanics,
Hmm.
contrast them with us mammals, and really explore the why behind these paths, especially thinking about something like, flight.
Okay, so where should we start? Amphibians, maybe, as a kind of baseline?
Good idea. Yeah, amphibians first. They're kind of the jacks of all trades when it comes to breathing.
Huh, yeah, multimodal is the term. They really do mix and match.
So how does that work? They start with gills.
Typically, yeah. As larvae, like tadpoles, they're fully aquatic, using gills. But then, as most adults, they develop lungs. Though, interestingly, some actually keep their gills their whole lives.
But the skin thing,
Yeah.
that's what always stands out with frogs and salamanders,
Right.
breathing through their skin.
Cutaneous respiration, yeah, it's a huge part of it for many of them. But it relies on a couple of key things.
Okay.
The skin has to stay moist, really moist. And it's packed with blood vessels right near the surface, highly vascularized, so oxygen just diffuses across that wet layer into the blood. CO2 goes out the same way.
Okay, so that's the link to water or damp habitats. Keeping that skin wet is non-negotiable.
Hmm.
Sounds like a bit of a liability on dry land, though.
It definitely is. It works brilliantly for their typical lifestyle, but dehydration is a constant risk if they stray too far from moisture. And even their lungs, the adult lungs, they're often seen as fairly simple structures compared to ours.
Simple how? What's different?
Well, for one, they often lack a diaphragm, which is our main breathing muscle, so they can't just expand their chest like we do.
So how do they get air in?
They often use something called buccal pumping. Basically, they use muscles in their mouth and throat to kind of force or gulp air down into the lungs. It's a positive pressure system, not negative pressure like ours.
Okay, got it. So amphibians, versatile with gills, simple lungs, plus that crucial skin breathing, but tied to moisture. Let's completely switch gears now. Birds. Talk about an extreme respiratory challenge,
Oh, absolutely. Powered flight, it's just about the most energetically expensive way to move around.
which means they need a ton of oxygen constantly for those muscles. And they're producing loads of CO2 that has to go somewhere fast.
Exactly. And that incredible demand is really what drove the evolution of their, frankly, radical respiratory system. It's fundamentally different from mammals.
Right, the first thing that jumps out in the sources is their lungs aren't big and spongy like ours. They're described as small, dense, and rigid.
That's it, precisely. Avian lungs are compact, they're dense, and remarkably, they don't really change shape or volume much. They're kind of fixed in place, anchored to the skeleton.
No inflation deflation.
Yeah, in the way we think of it.
Yeah.
And like amphibians, they don't have a diaphragm either.
So, rigid lungs, no diaphragm.
Ah,
How on earth do they move the air?
that's where the air sacs come in. This is the key.
Okay, tell me about the air sacs.
Birds usually have 9 of these. They're thin-walled, almost balloon-like structures spread through the body cavity. They even extend into the hollow spaces in some bones. That's called pneumaticity. Helps with weight saving, too.
Huh. So they're like extra storage tanks for air?
Sort of, but crucially, they're not where most gas exchange happens. Their walls are thin, but they don't have a rich blood supply like the lungs do.
So, if they're not exchanging gas, what are they doing?
They're the bellows. Pure and simple. They store air and then push it through the rigid lungs. It's this brilliant separation of tasks.
A separation.
Yeah, ventilation, the moving of air is done by the air sacs. Respiration, the actual gas exchange, happens in the lungs. Mammals combine those jobs in one structure. Birds split them.
Okay, interesting. Air sacs pump, lungs exchange. Let's trace the air path then. In through the trachea.
Yep, the windpipe. Often longer and wider in birds than mammals, which creates some dead space, but they compensate. And down at the base where it splits, they have the syrinx.
Ah, their voice box. That's how they make all those complex songs.
Exactly. Different spot from our larynx. Then the primary bronchi, the main tubes splitting off, do something really weird from our perspective.
Hey.
You pass all the way through the lungs.
Wait, through them, not just branching inside them.
Nope, right through, like a highway passing through a city. Then, within the lung tissue itself, they branch into secondary bronchi and then into this incredibly dense network of tiny tubes.
And these tiny tubes are where the action is.
These are the parabronchi, microscopic, maybe a millimeter across. And the walls of these parabronchi are where gas exchange occurs.
What's on the walls?
Even smaller structures. Tiny openings lead into chambers called atria, then funnel-like infundibula, and finally into a vast network of what are called air capillaries. These are minuscule, maybe 5 micrometers wide.
Smaller than our alveoli.
Much smaller. And this dense mesh of air capillaries is interwoven with an equally dense mesh of blood capillaries. That interface is the gas exchange surface.
Wow. So air capillaries woven with blood capillaries packed into rigid lungs with air sacs acting like bellows pushing air across them.
You've got it. That's the fundamental design. Separating the pump from the exchanger allows the lung part to be incredibly specialized for maximizing surface area and minimizing diffusion distance, all without the mechanical stress of constantly changing size.
Okay, the structure is clearly unique, but the part that really bends my mind is the airflow itself. It's not just in and out.
Not even close. This is probably the most remarkable feature. It takes 2 full breath cycles, 2 inhalations, and 2 exhalations for one packet of air to move completely through the system.
2 cycles for 1 breath's worth of air. How does that work? Can you walk me through it?
It seems complicated, but it's incredibly efficient. Let's follow 1 gulp of air.
Okay.
First, inhalation. Bird breathes in, fresh air comes down the trachea, most of it flows past the lungs and into the posterior air sacs, the ones further back in the body. They expand. Some air also goes into the lungs proper.
So inhale 1 fills the back sacs mostly.
Right. First exhalation, bird breathes out. Those posterior sacs compress, squeezing that fresh air forward, and where does it go? Into the parabronchi of the lungs. This is where the primary gas exchange happens.
So fresh air hits the lungs on the exhale.
On the first exhale, yes. Meanwhile, the air that was already in the lungs from a previous cycle, now stale, lower in oxygen, gets pushed out of the lungs and into the anterior air sacs, the ones closer to the head.
Okay, inhale 1 fills the back, exhale 1 pushes fresh air into lungs, stale air into front sacs. Got it. What next?
Second inhalation. Bird breathes in again. More fresh air comes down, again, mostly filling those posterior sacs, some entering the lungs. The stale air that just got pushed into the anterior sac, it just stays put during this inhale.
Okay.
Second exhalation, bird breathes out the second time. Now the anterior sacs compress, pushing that stale air out of the bird completely, up the trachea. And at the same time, the fresh air that went into the posterior sacs during the second inhale is now pushed forward into the lungs.
Whoa. Okay, so air is flowing through the lungs across those parabronchi during both inhalation and exhalation. It's like a continuous flow.
Exactly. It's a unidirectional flow, generally moving from back to front through the gas-exchanging parabronchi. It never really stops or reverses there. That's the revolutionary part compared to our tidal flow.
How does it stay one way? Are there little valves opening and closing?
You'd think so, but apparently not muscular valves. The sources suggest it's mostly down to aerodynamics. The precise shape and angles of the bronchial tubes, the way they branch, maybe even air inertia, it all works together to guide the air along that one-way path, like aerodynamic valves.
That's amazing. The plumbing itself directs the flow.
It's incredibly elegant engineering.
Mm.
And the payoff is huge.
Which is?
Because of that continuous unidirectional flow, the gas exchange surfaces are almost always bathed in relatively fresh, high-oxygen air. There's very little mixing with stale, CO2-rich air like in our lungs. This keeps the oxygen gradient, the driving force for diffusion, consistently high.
Which is crucial for meeting those insane energy demands of flight, especially if they're flying high up where oxygen is thinner.
Absolutely. It allows them to extract much more oxygen from each unit of air they breathe. The estimates are often around 25% more efficient than mammals in that respect.
Okay, let's zoom in on the exchange itself. You mentioned air capillaries and blood capillaries. How does the cross-current thing work?
Right. So the way the tiny blood capillaries are arranged relative to the tiny air capillaries creates this cross-current pattern. Blood generally flows at an angle, often nearly perpendicular to the direction the air is moving through the parabronchi network.
And what's the advantage of that angle?
In our mammalian pool system, the blood leaving the alveoli can only get as oxygen-rich as the mixed air in the alveoli. But with cross-current, because fresh blood is constantly encountering progressively fresher air along its path, the blood leaving the exchange region can actually end up with a higher oxygen partial pressure than the air that's leaving that same region. It just allows for a more complete transfer.
So it's another layer of efficiency, not just the flow pattern, but the micro-level exchange is also optimized.
Exactly. It adds up. And it's worth pointing out, while birds flying use, 10 or 15 times more oxygen than when resting.
Which sounds enormous.
It is. But the increase is actually pretty similar to what a fit human athlete achieves during intense exercise. The big difference isn't necessarily a massively higher baseline metabolism or radically better blood chemistry, though there are some adaptations there too. It's the sheer efficiency of the lung system itself in extracting the needed oxygen.
Getting more out of the air they breathe. And the whole structure is very dense, right?
Extremely. The amount of gas exchange surface area packed into a given volume of lung is about 10 times greater in birds than mammals. They fit more capillary blood into that compact, rigid space.
Just optimized for throughput. And there are even more specializations on top of this, depending on the bird.
Oh, yeah. Soaring birds, like eagles, have this extra air sac bit called the subpectoral diverticulum, or SPD.
Right, the one found by accident with CT scans.
That's the one. And it seems to be involved in tweaking the mechanics of their flight muscles, somehow making that sustained gliding easier, less costly.
Wow, a breathing structure affecting muscle mechanics. Cool. What about divers, like penguins or puffins?
They have different needs again. Holding their breath underwater, managing buoyancy. So you see adaptations like higher levels of myoglobin in muscles and hemoglobin in blood to store more oxygen, maybe larger red blood cells. They can also shunt blood flow preferentially to vital organs and diving muscles and use their air sacs to help control how buoyant they are.
So the basic theme is adaptable. Incredible flexibility built on that core design.
Exactly.
Okay, let's circle back now and properly unpack the mammalian system, ours, as the direct contrast, the tidal flow system.
Right. Much simpler in concept, maybe. Air comes in, hopefully through the nose to get filtered, warmed, humidified. Then down the pharynx, past the larynx or voice box into the trachea, held open by those cartilage rings.
And then it branches like a tree.
Just like that. The bronchial tree, bronchi split into smaller bronchi, then into tiny bronchioles. This is all just the plumbing, the conducting zone. No real gas exchange here.
That happens right at the tips of the branches.
In the alveoli, millions of them. These tiny, thin-walled air sacs, clustered like grapes. About 300 million per lung in humans, give or take.
300 million. That must create a huge surface area.
Immense. If you could spread them all out flat, it's often compared to a tennis court. And the walls are incredibly thin, just one cell thick in places. And they're absolutely covered in a dense web of capillaries. That's the spot O2 diffuses from the air into the blood. CO2 diffuses from blood into the air.
And how do we actually pull the air in and push it out?
The mechanics. It's all about changing the volume of the chest cavity. Boyle's law: volume goes up, pressure goes down. The main muscle is the diaphragm, that big sheet under the lungs. When it contracts, it pulls down, increasing the chest volume.
Rib muscles help too.
The external intercostals, yeah. They lift the ribs up and out, also increasing volume. And the lungs themselves are sort of stuck to the inside of the chest wall by the pleural membranes and fluids. So as the chest expands, the lungs get pulled open with it.
Creating lower pressure inside so air rushes in.
Exactly. Inhalation.
And breathing out is just the reverse.
Yeah. For quiet breathing, mostly passive, the diaphragm and intercostals relax. The natural elasticity of the lungs and chest wall makes everything shrink back down. Volume decreases, pressure increases, air flows out. If you force an exhale, like blowing out candles, then you use abdominal muscles and internal intercostals.
Okay. Alveoli for exchange, diaphragm, and ribs for the pump.
Yeah.
But the crucial difference, again, is that back and forth tidal flow.
That's fundamental. We never fully empty our lungs. There's always some air left, the residual volume. So every time you breathe in, that fresh air mixes with the stale air already sitting in the alveoli.
And the result of that mixing is?
The oxygen level, the partial pressure of oxygen inside your alveoli, is always lower than the fresh air you just breathed in. It's a blended average. This is the ventilated pool model. The gas composition is fairly uniform across the alveoli, but it's diluted compared to outside air.
So right there, compared to the bird's continuous fresh flow, our system seems less efficient per breath for grabbing oxygen.
Per unit of air processed, yes. That mixing, plus the dead space air in the trachea and bronchi that never reaches the alveoli, means we extract a smaller fraction of the available oxygen with each breath compared to the bird system.
Clearly it works. Mammals are everywhere doing everything. What are the advantages of our system?
Well, despite that lower per breath efficiency, the alveolar design is incredibly scalable. That massive total surface area is the key compensator. It supports tiny shrews, right up to blue whales. It works across a huge range of body sizes and activity levels on land and in water. And having the lungs internal is vital for conserving water in terrestrial environments, something amphibians struggle with.
Good point. Skin breathing is too leaky for most mammals. Any downsides mentioned in the sources, besides efficiency? Maybe biomechanically.
Yeah, one interesting point is that because our lungs have to be stretchy and elastic for this tidal breathing, those delicate alveolar capillaries are constantly being stretched and relaxed with every breath. They also face the pulsing pressure from the heart. The idea is that maybe they're under more mechanical stress, less supported, than the capillaries embedded in the rigid structure of a bird lung.
Different trade-offs.
Yeah.
Okay, so these two incredibly different systems. How did they evolve? Where did they diverge?
Well, they both trace back to a common ancestor, an early amniote, way back. But they took very different paths after that split.
Lungs themselves are much older, though, right?
Oh, yes. Lungs probably originated way back in the Devonian, maybe as simple air sacs off the throat in fish living in low oxygen water. They likely became paired structures in early tetrapods.
And the ancestors of mammals and reptiles birds, maybe 300 million years ago, had fairly simple lungs.
Probably lungs with some internal walls or fold septate lungs, but not the complex structures we see today. Then came that major split between the synapsids, our line, and the diapsids, the line leading to reptiles and birds. And from that point, each lineage independently evolved its own highly specialized respiratory system.
It's amazing. Faced with similar needs like warm-bloodedness, high activity, they arrived at such different solutions.
It really is. You might have predicted convergence, but instead you get these two fundamentally distinct masterpieces of biological engineering. The alveolar lung and the parabronchial lung with air sacs.
So let's try to pull this all together then, the big picture.
You've got amphibians using a flexible toolkit gills, skin, simple lungs but often tied to water. You have mammals with our highly scalable, huge surface area alveolar system using tidal flow, great for terrestrial life across many sizes.
And then birds with this incredibly sophisticated two-cycle unidirectional flow system using rigid lungs for exchange and air sacs as bellows.
Which is just this phenomenal adaptation specifically for the massive energy demands of flight, squeezing the maximum oxygen out of every breath, even at altitude. It's a marvel of efficiency.
Truly. And it's fascinating that, as the sources note, studying systems like the bird lung might even give us ideas for new technologies, like better oxygen extraction systems.
Yeah, biomimicry. Learning from nature's solutions. It shows how understanding these deep biological details can sometimes spark innovation elsewhere.
So what's the takeaway here? From breathing through skin to these unbelievably complex bird lungs, nature's inventiveness in solving this basic need for oxygen is just astounding.
Right. These aren't just biological quirks in amphibians, birds, and mammals. They're elegant, evolved answers, precisely shaped by millions of years of different lifestyles and environmental pressures.
It really makes you think when you see how incredibly fine-tuned a system like the avian one had to become. What does that tell you about the pressures that shaped our own breathing? And, maybe more broadly, what other layers of amazing hidden complexity are humming away inside us in all the everyday functions of life that we just completely take for granted?